It's October 1965. Ian Brady and his girlfriend Myra Hindley have been charged with murder, leading police to search Saddleworth Moor for the bodies of up to 11 people. Charlton Athletic have brought on the first ever substitute to be used in a Football League match following injury to one of their players. Barry Maguire's protest anthem, Eve of Destruction, has reached the number one spot of the US Billboard Hot 100 as the US Army becomes more engulfed in the Vietnam War, and the epic science fiction novel Dune, written by Frank Herbert, has been published. Meanwhile, John Lennon is suffering from a case of creativity block while attempting to write material for their new album, Rubber Soul. As dawn approaches, he thinks to himself, I'm getting nowhere with this, and inspiration strikes. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. We examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician David Bennett unpicks the lyrics and music. So please me and like, comment and subscribe to UnBeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we're discussing Nowhere Man. So David, Nowhere Man, recorded in October 1965 to be a part of the Rubber Soul album, finally released in December of 1965. What is it that strikes you about this song?
For me, what is so elegant about this song is that it's almost just 16 bars of music just span out into a song through a wonderful arrangement. We open with an a cappella. We open no intro, just straight into the top of the song. That's our first 8 bars. That's the opening section. He's a real nowhere man, sitting in his nowhere land. We've already heard half the song effectively just in that opening bit. And then of course the other 8 bars is what you might think of as the chorus or the middle 8, the nowhere man, don't worry. This section here is just providing another 8 bars. And together, that's basically the whole song. But, put that way, it makes it sound trivial and sort of easy. But the elegance of the arrangement comes in all of the subtle ways that it's been span out. We never really get a clean repeat. We go back and forth between the sections in different orders. And we have so many lovely little elements, like, for example, Paul McCartney's bass line, which we'll dive into a bit more later on.
So, as you said, David, the thing that strikes you first, because it's the first thing we hear, is the a cappella introduction of George, John and Paul singing the refrain or the verse, as you said, of Nowhere Man. It's a striking artistic choice. And I think we can take this all back to the context of the Beatles expanding their horizons in the studio and in their daily lives. So the context around Nowhere Man, just to spin that a little bit, is that they were broadening their cultural horizons. London was beginning to swing. It's 1965, and their contemporaries are beginning to write songs that expand upon world topics or discuss things that isn't a boy-girl relationship. Love is looking passé. It's looking like it's in the past. The Who are singing about I hope I die before I get old. Bob Dylan is writing his protest anthems, his Nobel Prize winning songs. And at the time, there is this sort of cross-pollination between folk and rock music, with the Byrds in America obviously taking some of the Bob Dylan songs and creating a sort of more rock pop tinge to them with songs like My Back Pages and Mr. Tambourine Man. So the Beatles are hearing what's from coming across the pond. They're, broadening their horizons in a cultural sense in London. They're reading more. They're going to art galleries. They're becoming involved in that world. And also at the same time, they are beginning to experiment with drugs. They are starting to smoke cannabis, and they've taken LSD by this point. While on tour in LA, in summer of 1965, they actually met some of the Byrds, and then that's where they took acid and discussed their shared love of music, and actually played 12-string Rickenbacker guitars, which will become a key feature of this song. So, having just finished their US tour, they're back on home soil, and they have got a little bit of downtime to write most of the material for what will become the Rubber Soul album. John Lennon is creatively frustrated, and he is just trying so hard to write a new song that he's driven himself to stay awake, whether it's because of the desire to write a song or whether he was maybe indulging in other activities. But he is up at dawn. And while being up at dawn, he begins writing Nowhere Man. And as he put it, he receives it at dawn. He has turned off his brain. He has almost just tried to let the creativity flow through him. And that is where Nowhere Man sort of comes to him in that form. And it was just John's way of being frustrated, trying to give up, and just trying to see where it would lead him.
Yeah, and what I find interesting is this song is almost, this whole album really, Rubber Soul, is the transition between the old Beatles and the new. Very, very soon we're going to get Revolver, which is wildly different, far more mature and eccentric, and as you said, less focused on love. And this song is almost one of the early signs of that. Instrumentally, it sounds quite like an old Beatles song. It sounds like it could have been on Help, maybe. But lyrically, it's going in a whole new, sort of more introspective direction.
And that's key. John's introspection is starting to take hold, whether it's the drugs or whether it's just his shift in writing. But he says himself, he was like a medium corresponding with the dead. And he says that's when it's his favourite writing experience, is when he just feels like some sort of... he's been possessed by some sort of creative demon that is taking over and it's just spilling out of him. Yeah. So Paul arrives the next day for the writing session. He finds John bleary-eyed on the sofa as he's tried to get a little bit of sleep since he's been working on the song. And he pretty much just shows him what he did that morning, pretty much. And Paul jumps straight in, and they do the classic songwriting partnership of that time was Paul would arrive at John's house out in Surrey, and they would just get to work with whatever they had lying around. And it was sort of that eyeball-to-eyeball thing that they've discussed in the past. Paul jumped in, helped him finish a few of the lyrics, we think. And we'll discuss the lyrics later on, but it is John sort of beginning to question himself. Where's he going? What's he doing? And as you said, it is sort of the beginning of John's introspection phase with In My Life, and what would come later with Strawberry Fields Forever and Julia.
Yeah, and talking of Paul's contributions, we don't really know exactly how much musically he contributed, but one touch that he did add is effectively he inverted one of the chords. So to invert a chord just means you put a note in the bass that's not the root note. So in Nowhere Man, in the opening section, we get this bit that goes... Making all his nowhere plans for no... It goes to F sharp minor, A minor, and an E. So it's the F sharp minor where Paul did something a bit different. You'd think you'd put F sharp in the bass like I'm doing right now. But actually, Paul's bass line puts A in the bass line, which makes the chord above effectively an A6 chord. So you get A6 moving to A minor and an E. So it's just a really subtle change, but that's the sort of power that the bass has. It can kind of recontextualize chords, and something that Paul did on various occasions on Beatles songs.
One of Paul's biggest contributions to this album is he's really starting to evolve his bass lines. He's sort of starting to take it in a counter-melodic direction, as well as just sort of raising it up in the mix so that it becomes a prominent feature of their songs.
It's a really prominent feature of the bass line in this song. And, in earlier Beatles tracks, Paul's bass line was never boring. He often had a sort of walking thing, like a very typical rock and roll sort of thing. So he was used to a dynamic bass part. But as you said, he gets very melodic now. He's contributing a counter melody, which is a hallmark of later Beatles songs. And this is such a great early example of it. Because, I just said about how underneath the F sharp minor chord, he plays an A. But he's not just playing an A, it's got a whole melody to it. It goes... So it's like another hook in the song, just down in the low section. The whole song has this very active bass line. There's so much going on there, and just to get some context there, Paul easily could have just gone, just stuck to the bass notes, the root notes, and that would have been fine. But instead, he's got this whole, whole motion going on there, which I think is a symptom of him being both a songwriter and a guitarist, as well as the band's bass player.
And discounting Paul's contribution, the rhythm track of the song is fairly basic. We've got John on his jumbo Gibson acoustic guitar. We've got Ringo playing a fairly simple backbeat. And we've got George Harrison just weaving in and out with simple licks. We'll get to the guitar solo in a moment. But it's a fairly simple song. It's slow in pace. It's got a bit of a drawl, it's almost a dirge in a way. It's not the fast rock and roll pop that they'd produced years earlier.
Yeah, and what's interesting is if you hear the earlier demo version of this track, which I think only came out on the recent anthology collection. I might be wrong about that, but the recent update to the anthology collection, you can hear how originally it had more of a Latin-inspired rhythm to it, more syncopated, which may have been how Paul originally came up with this very active bass line. Because this bass line has loads of what we call pushed rhythms. It keeps pushing into the next bar. It doesn't wait for the next bar to begin. It kind of skips ahead. And that might have been kind of coming off the back of Ringo's original drum part, but then when they changed it for whatever reason, Paul was still, happy to stick with that syncopated bass idea.
And to get onto the guitar solo, because it's one of the major features of this song, is that treble heavy. So for people that might not know, treble is the taking out all the sort of bassy notes of a guitar and replacing it with sort of the high end,
the brightness, the
crispness, yes, of the guitar, and that was played on dueling Fender Stratocasters with John and George playing in unison, and it's got that very twangy sound that is very reminiscent of that time of that sort of folk rock boom, especially with the Byrds and Bob Dylan and the Beatles and other bands of that era, Jefferson Airplane, which is funny because they are known for that sound, and then the Beatles adopt it because of the Byrds. But the Byrds were just trying to do the Beatles in 1964 with A Hard Day's Night and that chord on the Rickenbacker 12-string.
Yeah, well, it's all circular and they're all paying attention to each other. And something I find interesting as well, as you said, they've double-tracked this guitar solo, which isn't something that they can do live. And this was still just about the era when they were still playing these songs live. There are live versions you can watch on YouTube of Nowhere Man. They've double-tracked the guitar, they've double-tracked the vocal, which is a common thing they would do. So they're already getting into that space of thinking of the studio as more than just a way of capturing a live performance. It's a way of augmenting it and creating a sound that you couldn't get in a live environment.
And to just jump on that as well, they wanted the guitar solo to be so trebly that they asked the engineer to put the treble up to full. And then when they were like, it's not trebly enough, they went, well, we're at full. And then so they were like, could you bounce that track down with full treble onto another one and then feed it through the desk, and then can we put the treble up on that, so almost doubling the treble? And they were like, oh, we can't do that. And they were like, oh, just try it for us, humor us in this. And that's how it happened. That's how they got that sort of really twangy sound on the guitars.
It's such a sound, and I really think this is the dawn of when the Beatles got to a point where each song had its own character, because they each had their own little micro experiments in the studio, whether it's how much treble can we get on the guitar solo, or putting drum loops on something, or whatever. It's the beginning of that way of thinking.
And we've got to say that's because EMI own the recording studio. We know it as Abbey Road Studios, but it's actually EMI Studios. And as the Beatles are their big money makers, the Beatles are starting to get a little bit more freedom, a little bit more time, rather than slots. They're starting to get days, and they're starting to adopt a new working system where they work, maybe come in the afternoon and they work till, at this point, it's roughly midnight. So they're getting later and later into the night. And as the time goes on, that, especially during Sgt. Pepper, that midnight pushes to 4, 5, 6 in the morning quite often. It's
a big part of this revolution that happened in recording, approaching recordings as their own medium rather than just trying to bottle a live performance, because it's literally a case of resources. You need to have that time, money and expertise to create these sounds, and back in the 60s that was very, very rare.
So this song was recorded in pretty much one day. They had a pop at it the day before, and then they didn't like anything they'd done there, so then they scrapped it all, and then they reconvened the next day. So it was recorded all in one day, and it was kind of recorded on the hoof. They were rehearsing it in the studio as they sort of recorded it. So, as you said at the start, David, there is not a whole lot of sort of original bar to bar musical interest in the song. So, could you talk to us a little bit more about sort of how they came to that decision?
Well, yeah, so the song is only really, if you boil it down, got 16 bars worth of material. The two 8-bar chunks, what you might think of as the verse or refrain, like the A section, and the B section, which you might think of as a middle 8 or chorus. And that is very typical of this old form, this old songwriting structure known as 32-bar form, which is really typical in Tin Pan Alley songs, the old show tunes like Somewhere Over the Rainbow or Blue Moon, Cheek to Cheek, all of these old tunes that the Beatles were very familiar with. And they use this sort of arrangement a lot, particularly in the earlier days where you don't really have a verse and a chorus. You just have these two opposing ideas, A and B, both of which kind of can be a chorus. Both sections of the song mention Nowhere Man, and it just sort of doesn't matter which one's the main one. We have that first section, the A section, and of course the B section, the middle 8, which goes to this G sharp minor, and A, G sharp minor, A, so pivoting back and forth. So described like that, it seems really boring, but the Beatles spin it out. So we get two of the A sections back to back, then the B section, then we get an A section, but it's the guitar solo. So it's already got something new going on. We got the chords of the thing that came before, but with a new melody provided by the guitar. Then we get an A section again, a B section, A section, B section, A section. So we're not just getting a cookie cutter classic Tin Pan Alley arrangement. The Beatles, as always, have put their spin on it. But it is interesting to see John using this sort of form because, I think of songs like Here, There and Everywhere by Paul as a great example of this Tin Pan Alley arrangement. And I think Paul was, we can kind of trace the lineage back there because Paul grew up in a house full of jazz and swing because of his dad being a professional jazz musician. But John, he always seems to be more of a rock and roller. But, we see in songs like this, he has got that more, older retrospective approach to songwriting as too. He has a appreciation for all of music rather than just rock and roll.
And David, can you talk to us about the chords used in these songs? Is it advanced or is it fairly sort of rudimentary?
So it's almost quite rudimentary. Most of it is the most sort of bread and butter chords you would expect. We're in the key of E and we start on E. He's a real, go to B, Nowhere Man, A, E. So it's all very simple. But then we get more interesting with, as I said before, this A6, which is an F sharp minor chord, but with the A in the bass, thanks to Paul's bass line. And then the really interesting chord is this next one, A minor, whereas you'd normally have A major. So we're getting this move from sort of major to minor, and then back to the one chord. And that's a really classic sort of sentimental chord change. It sort of pulls at the heartstrings. And John had actually used this exact chord move, albeit in a different key, quite recently on In My Life, which is of course on the same album. On In My Life we're in the key of A and we have, that's F sharp minor now, and we go to D, or even D6, so once again the 6th chord, and then it's the minor. So this song definitely shares a lot of DNA with In My Life, and it's not unusual. I'm a songwriter too. It's not unusual that in a certain time period when you're writing songs, they all kind of have the similar chords because it's the chord sound you're into at that particular time in your life.
That's interesting because I've heard that major to minor chord change. So if we're on the A and then into the A minor, I've heard that described as the Elliott Smith chord transition.
Elliott Smith is very Beatley.
So Beatley, yeah. He's supposedly he was absolutely obsessed with the Beatles, and he would corner you and just talk about the Beatles for hours and hours. And Elliott Smith, for anyone that doesn't know, the sort of like indie folksy singer songwriter from America, almost shares no DNA with the sort of the Beatles in that way, but was completely obsessed and used that major to minor song technique in plenty of his tunes.
Yeah, well, Elliott Smith, he has a lot of Beatlisms going on. Particularly, he loved a double-tracked vocal, which is obviously a Beatles staple. But this major to minor move, where go back to the key of E, which is the key that Nowhere Man's in. To be more specific, we're talking about the fourth chord of the key, which is we're in the key of E, so A going to A minor. So it's 4 going to 4 minor, and then 1. And the ultimate example of that, tying back in with the whole Tin Pan Alley thing, is Every Time We Say Goodbye by Cole Porter, with the how strange the change from major to minor. A minor, E. So it's all kind of, it's all tying together there, and maybe that is the source of where John heard this chord change, is that old show tune. Or maybe it was just all in his head from the various different songs that have used that sort of classic, reliable, heart-wrenching sound.
So we've spoken about the music maybe looking back, but we can safely say for the lyrics that John is breaking new ground here. He is not writing about relationships or love. He is writing about, he's sort of looking in, he's getting introspective, and it's sort of like a confession of personal inadequacy. He is almost critiquing himself, I'd say. I think John, or maybe it was Paul that said that the Nowhere Man was John. He's sort of writing about himself as being blind as he can be, just sees what he wants to see. He's sort of having a dig at himself.
Yeah, well, I think, we've talked about before where John had this slump, a couple of years into the Beatles' success, and, all of the novelty of it, I'm sure, had started to wear off, and instead he was starting to wonder about, how legitimate of a musician he is, and whether he's just some sort of like pop fad. So, it's easy to think, oh, he's John Lennon. He should always feel fantastic. He's one of the greatest songwriters of all time. But at that time, he had his critics, and he also didn't know yet that they would, but we would still be talking about them so many years later. That he could have still been a flash in the pan novelty as far as he was aware.
I think also the line, "The world is at your command," but he's still sitting in his nowhere land, is sort of just what you were talking about there. John's got the world at his fingertips. He is the most successful person on the planet, yet he is still feeling nothing. He's not content. He's not happy. And I think also this sort of image of being a Beatle, and sort of carefully curated by Brian Epstein. They act as one. They're not really allowed to let much of their personality shine through. Obviously they do, but they are seen as the four-headed dog. They are one being as Beatles, and doesn't have a point of view, knows not where he's going to. They're just getting shipped from city to city, from hotel room to hotel room. You can sort of imagine John is writing from the heart here and going, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm going. My marriage is not working out well. I'm unhappy. I'm stuck in this big mansion. I've got the world at my fingertips, but ultimately I'm a nowhere man going nowhere, and I don't know what I'm to do with my life.
No, for sure. And yeah, as you said, as the years go on, he would become more and more inclined to just talk about his own experiences in this music. But it's almost like that had kind of been a self-imposed rule early on, that they didn't really write about themselves, just sort of about love and their fans, and almost this sort of fictitious sort of images and stories of lovers.
And just before we move off the lyrics, there's one more I want to sort of look to discuss, is as you said, the middle eight, or the chorus, whatever we want to call it. Take your time, don't worry, don't hurry, till somebody lends you a hand. And that's quite a reassuring message in all this sort of downbeat cynicism, is that, someone might lend you a hand. And if we're being sentimental, could we say it was that person could be Paul?
Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing. This song is an optimistic song. John is coming from a dark, sort of sad place to write it, but whether it's John singing to himself or Paul throwing a few sort of more positively minded lyrics in there, we don't know. It's a song encouraging the Nowhere Man to sort of come out of his stupor.
In the UK, it was released on Rubber Soul, but in the US, it was not released on Rubber Soul. due to the contractual agreement they had with Capitol, their record label in the US. UK and US releases were different for the large part of the Beatles' career, and the Capitol Records would save a song or two from each release the Beatles gave to them to then make another album of singles and B-sides. So this song never made it onto the Rubber Soul version in America. It actually made it onto Yesterday and Today, which caused controversy due to its album cover, its sleeve, where it looked like mangled dolls and babies.
Yeah, the Butcher cover.
Butcher cover,
yeah. Because that's what the Beatles described the Capitol record versions of the albums as the butchered albums, because they'd been all cut up and rearranged without really consulting them.
And that caused huge controversy. I didn't quite understand the extent of that controversy, but it was really criticised in the US, and we didn't get the album sleeve in the UK, but we did get that picture used as promotional material, so it was still seen. And John, with a little bit of his actual politics and his actual view shining through, so to discount everything we just spoke about in the lyrics of Nowhere Man, he says, if you can watch what's happening in Vietnam, you can look at this. So it speaks of the time.
Yeah.
And Capitol released it as a single because they saw the sort of potential of it, the catchiness, or maybe of the moment, with the San Francisco scene blossoming in America at the time, with bands like Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead all coming from that sort of plunging into that well. Capitol released, and it made it to number 3. So ultimately a bit of a failure, but they still saw some commercial potential for it.
Yeah, well, we're still in the era here where almost every song on a Beatles album feels like it could be a single. So, it's hard to remember which ones are singles and which ones aren't.
So in terms of the impact of Nowhere Man, we can say that it is a sign that any topic is suitable for songwriting in their eyes now, and that studio experimentation is the norm going forward. And yeah, Rubber Soul, first true artistic statement we can say to be produced by the Beatles, and this is a big part of it.
Yeah, definitely. This is very much that transitional album between the before and after, the touring years and the non-touring years, the pop Beatles and the more progressive Beatles. So it's a fantastic blend of both of those sounds.
And it was beginning to be treated as art, when pop music had sort of been dismissed as sort of a cultural fad. And now pop music was beginning to be treated as the sort of an art form worthy of time and of words printed. So Newsweek in the US gave this album a huge amount of coverage, and The Observer in the UK were the first newspaper to appoint a critic of pop culture. It was The Guardian in 1968 that would create the first pop music critic. New York Times began writing on it alongside Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home, also released that year, also pushing music to new heights and sort of showcasing what an artist can do with a statement, with songs like Maggie's Farm and It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And also the record sleeve was out there. It was very 60s. It was very of the time. It was stretched. It was warped. It sort of... Was it the beginning of the psychedelic era, do you think?
I think so, yeah. It was just sort of stumbling into existence. But it is crazy to think that there's only a few months between this album and then Revolver. Revolver really, it has completely shifted now. And to think full stop that the whole Beatles discography happened in less than 10 years is mad, with the amount of contrast that happens through their different eras.
Yeah, exactly. Months before this, they were writing I Feel Fine, or that's even more progressive than, A Hard Day's Night. Yeah, pure pop.
It was just bit by bit. They never rested on their laurels. They were always thinking, what can we do differently? What can we innovate this time?
Yeah, taking from folk, taking from pop, experimenting, and it would then herald the new era of the Beatles going forward, as you said, with Revolver. That's it for this episode of UnBeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell. Now make sure to like, subscribe and comment on YouTube wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for their 1969 mega hit, Let It Be. We'll see you next time we're out.
See you next time.